stuff that I just mentioned. Now, all of the stuff that I've been mentioning is on this one page. The other stuff is called dispensationalism. When we come back, I'm going to analyze some of this historically and tell you where some of the mojo crap is. But anyway, you have the end times here, and then you have eternity past to eternity future. Dispensationalism says that the Bible can be divided, and there's a verse in the Bible that says, rightly divide the Word of God. And they literally divide the Word of God into periods, time frames, dispensations. And during the dispensation of innocence, when there was creation, and Adam and Eve were in the garden, God did this. And then, of course, when they sinned, God stepped in, created a covenant with Adam and Eve. Then Adam and Eve had their generations, and of course, it got bad again under Noah, didn't it? Boy, it got bad, and God repented that He made man and sent the flood, and there's your rainbow. There's your rainbow. So that makes a new covenant. And then God, out of all of the peoples of the earth, chose a guy named Abram. He said, Abram, come here. I'm going to lead you to a new land. I just ain't going to tell you where. And you've got to follow me. And wherever I take you, and it just so happened that he landed in the Palestine area, and that became the full claim of the Jews on Palestine, although a little problem arose. He had another child. That first child was Esau. Oh, no, not Esau. Ishmael, which is the Arab nations coming from Abram. And then, of course, he had his own son, which is the Israelite line. And that was the patriarchal age. And then, of course, they screwed up again, and they got into captivity in Egypt. And we all know that story now. And Moses came along and gave them the law. And after the law, they screwed up. That's why they were carried away. Remember the two nations, north and south, carried away Babylon and Assyria? That's because they screwed up. Because God had to correct them. Finally, the only correction he could really come up with to solve this problem, the sin problem that man kept falling into, was to send his own son to die on the cross. And then when his son died and shed his blood, and the shedding of blood is a remission of sin, and now you have the dispensation of grace. And then you will have the dispensation of the end time where Jesus comes and reigns and rules. So, if you want to see how they do this thing, you can look at this baby, but I'm not making it up. It's really here, okay? There are people who make books and make money and do all kinds of stuff here based upon this stuff. So I'm going to stop for just a moment. Any questions?
Where the hell did all the hippie crap
Where they what?
Where the hell did all the hippie crap in Christianity come from then? Like, love your neighbor and Jesus was the great moral teacher and all that crap.
You know, we could get into a very interesting side discussion because the typical way that Christians want to portray Jesus is the turn your cheek, love your neighbor, pray for those who persecute you Jesus. They don't want to talk about the Jesus who said, I came with a sword. I came to divide father from son, daughter from mother, brother from brother. They don't want to talk about that Jesus. They want to talk about the nice, loving Jesus. So what she's talking about is a tendency. When you start stripping away the Bible of its inerrancy and its divinity, its divine inspiration, now you have to pick and choose portions of the Bible that seem to be able to be more palatable. I mean, there are portions of the Bible that actually talk about men and women being equal. Oh, sure. Women be silent in the churches. Women be subject to your husbands. Women not allow a woman to teach a man. So you really have to kind of do this cherry-picking type of choice about the Bible and what it says. Now, the true believing fundamentalists say that's whitewashing and watering down the Bible and Jesus. Because they like the Jesus who's coming in power. They like the Jesus who's coming to reign and rule. They like the Jesus who cleaned out the temple. They like the Jesus who, who died and rose from the dead and overcame and went into hell and freed the captives. And they like all of that, as well as the love. So that the hippie Jesus, if you want to use that term, has been popular with various groups for a long time, because some groups look at what the fundamentalists say and say, well, we don't want to go there. And so they pick out some passages that they think portray Jesus in that way. By the way, I just got been watching Malcolm X again, and it's interesting that they portray it in the movie where he's talking to a minister when he's in prison. And there's these pictures of Jesus being white and very European looking. And he says to the minister, well, Jesus was obviously a Hebrew. And if he was a Hebrew, he was a person of color. And the minister has said in the movie, he said, well, everyone knows that God is white. We tend to make our gods in our image. So if you're a hippie long-hair who believe in love, peace, do your own thing, you create Jesus in your own image. And that's what often happens. Any other questions? Yeah?
Yeah, I just kind of wondered, I mean, we were talking about these different signs and so forth, and how maybe those were interpreted, say, in the, 1200, 1300, or, prior to 1948, just kind of a little comparison.
Yes. Actually, when we come back, I'll amplify that, but I'll give you the short answer, then we'll go into more detail. This idea of premillennialism that I've got up here, basically, you see that coming around in the I'm going to say 1800s. I'll give you the details about how it came to America and how it developed. In the 1800s, this whole concept of the rapture and premillennialism became very popular. Prior to that, remember I said there was the amillennialists? Basically, amillennialism says there's no millennium. Jesus isn't coming back to set up a millennium. The millennium is going to be set up through the church. So when you had the Catholic Church and you had the Council of Nicaea in 325, and you had the 2nd century church fathers, they really took these same Bible verses and they spiritualized them, allegoricalized them, metaphorized them into not a body literal return of Jesus, but actually Jesus ruling through the church, which really had a good effect, because that's one of the ways that the Catholic Church maintained its control from that period of time up to the Protestant Reformation, almost a period of 1,000 years or more, over the kings and over the countries of Europe, and really shaped a great deal of our Western civilization by claiming that they had the ultimate authority of God, of Jesus, and Jesus was reigning and ruling through the church. So we'll come back and deal with that a little bit more too. Any other questions? Yeah.
That's almost exactly, in fact, that is exactly what I was taught in the Baptist church, with one exception, that when Jesus raptures people out, the little babies would be taken with him because they're innocent.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So they won't die in the car crash or the plane crash.
Okay.
So God is merciful.
God is merciful.
And the patience left open on the operating table were obviously sinners and deserve it anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Now, here's an interesting one, because I just listened to Jimmy Swaggart son preach. I listen to these jerks every now and then. Anyway, I was watching the Jimmy Swaggart hour, and his son was preaching, and he went around, and get over this just gripes me. He says, I have children who now have children. I have my little baby grandchildren. The one was just a few months old, and the other was around 2-ish. And he said, they have both been born in sin. Original sin. So that theory has to be questioned, because these babies have been born in sin. They have not yet been washed in the blood. So how do they get saved, and how do they get into the rapture when they're not technically a part of the church, according to other Baptists who maintain that you have to have believer baptism and you have to be baptized as a sign of your salvation and your confirmation that God has done his work of grace in you. So they kind of contradict themselves by saying, okay, we're going to let the babies in. Now, the Catholics were in the same problem many years ago, and they made up the doctrine of purgatory. And they made up purgatory because it was just terrible to think that these little babies, because they hadn't been christened or they hadn't been brought into the church, would die before, and they would go